of disagreement.
Margaret, I couldn't hear everything that you had to say, so let me just pick up on something else if I can. As we flew in here today, we flew over northern Kuwait, which is virtually still aflame. General Schwarzkopf described that as looking like hell, is the way he put it. And we've arrived at this base, which has got heavy security around it, and they're now beginning to say here that they're seeing some Kuwaitis who are escaping from Iraq moving south, and they expect to see more and more Iraqis as well, because in the city of Basra, to which you may have been referring, there are continuing reports of a real rebellion in the streets there.
Tom, I don't know if you can hear me any more clearly at this point, but let me ask you a bit about the arrangements that have been made to bring the Iraqis to this location, this heavily fortified U.S. position within Iraq. What's happened?
I can hear you now. They arrived overland. They did not come by helicopter. They were met 5 kilometers out, which is about 3 miles altogether. They were met by Bradley vehicles, which are heavily armed, and they had Cobras flying overhead, which are the attack helicopters of the United States Army. They were told that they should leave their weapons behind in their own vehicles. They were then driven here with both the Bradley fighting vehicle on either side and trailing them, and helicopters overhead, and they were escorted into a kind of holding tent where they met with General Schwarzkopf. The Iraqi military representatives, I couldn't tell you what their ranks were exactly, were as always very dapper. They seem to have better tailors than they do have military tactics, and they went on into the tent, and that's where they are at the moment.
Tom, let me return quickly to my previous question about the Kuwaitis and third country foreigners held by Iraq. The Kuwaitis say some 20,000 Kuwaitis are being held by Iraq still, and the Iraqis have said they're ready to release the POWs but have not commented on those private citizens. Are you hearing anything more from there about whether or not that's going to be a major point of disagreement between the U.S. and Iraqi officials?
I think that General Schwarzkopf put it bluntly when he said, I'm not here to give up on anything, and they're not here to be able to ask for anything. We're going to tell them what we want. And in the release that we saw beforehand, the third country nationals, including the Kuwaitis, were right there with the prisoners of war. That is, that they were in the same paragraph. So I don't think that there's any separation on the part of General Schwarzkopf. And of course, he holds all the cards. And if those generals from the Iraqi side were not impressed before they arrived here, they had to be as they arrived in their own country and looked around and saw Bradley fighting vehicles and the new Abrams tank and Cobras flying overhead, and a whole lot of firepower right in their southern flank. So I think that they know that they don't have a heck of a lot of negotiation room right now.
Tom Brokaw, thank you very much. As you can see, Iraqi military commanders, also allied commanders, meeting in southern Iraq to lay the groundwork for the conditions of a permanent ceasefire. U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf saying he is there, quote, to tell the Iraqis what to do to effect that ceasefire. There will be no negotiations, apparently. We'll have further details on this NBC station as developments warrant, and full coverage on Sunday Today. This has been an NBC special report. I'm Margaret Larson, NBC News, New York.
This is one final question about the PLO. It has subsisted for years on payoffs, essentially, from wealthy regimes, including those in the Gulf states, and particularly that of Saudi Arabia. Yes. Do you think it's realistic to entertain the hope that Saudi Arabia has learned a lesson and might now give some of that largesse to an alternative Palestinian leadership on the West Bank?
Secretary Baker will certainly be discussing this issue, among others, with the Saudi leadership. But I would think that that the Saudis, who have performed so well in this whole crisis, should come out of it with a renewed sense of self-confidence.
The conventional wisdom at the moment is that Saddam Hussein is through. He'll seek exile someplace. He'll be overthrown by his own people. Is it conceivable that he could remain in power in Iraq?
Well, I don't know. That's a very speculative question, Sam. I wouldn't rule it out.
What we might do about it might have something to say about the answer.
In a regime like that, it seems to me, by its very nature, it's difficult for a humiliated leader who therefore has lost his legitimacy to stay in power unless he can demonstrate that he was duped or misled or his plans were not executed properly by his subordinates. And in other words, that he can get suitable scapegoats and cleanse himself from this defeat. That remains to be seen.
But of course, the official news agencies in Iraq, still controlled apparently by Saddam Hussein, are calling this a victory for them.
They are, but all the troops streaming home will
And the
have a
ones who are
different
not
idea.
streaming home, I take
And
it.
the ones who are not streaming home, the ones who are POWs now, will come home and tell their families a very different story, and that will get around. And there are already some disturbances.
Well, could
in
the
southern
coalition tolerate his remaining in power?
Iraq. I think it could tolerate it, but I think the character of the peace could depend quite a bit on whether or not Saddam Hussein remains in power.
The president says, with regard to perhaps pressure put on the Iraqis to get rid of this man, the president says not one dime of aid for Iraq. I presume there's a codicil over that. Not one dime of aid as long as Iraq is governed by the people who caused this mess.
Yes.
Are we trying to put pressure on the Iraqis by dangling some money in front of them, saying aid might be forthcoming if you get rid of this guy?
No, George, we're not.
They shouldn't need our money, should they? They got oil wells bigger than ours.
Well, that's one of the interesting myths that Saddam perpetrated, and that is the rich against the poor. Iraq is one of the rich. It's just that the money all went into his awesome military machine. We're seeing
And two
now,
wars.
That's
Two
right.
wars.
And we're seeing now more and more the extent to which he poured money into this military operation. It was tremendous.
General, take a broad look at the Middle East today. King Hussein of Jordan has lost a good deal of whatever prestige he may ever have had. Yasser Arafat has made a fool of himself. Saddam Hussein has pretty much blown himself out of the water. Saudi Arabia has become a power where it was never seen to be a power before, or thought to be a power. The map of the Middle East has changed remarkably. Can you, this is guesswork, I know, what do you see coming out all of this in the next year or so?
I think that really, in a sense, David, the hard work is ahead, and that is taking advantage of this minute tragedy and turning it to produce increased stability and security in the Middle East. And I think you have outlined the ingredients that have changed, and most of them have changed in a positive direction. It'll be hard work, it'll be difficult work. It's a lot harder to cooperate in peaceful ventures than it is in prosecuting a war. But I think it is the challenge before us now.
General Scowcroft, there are reports that in late October, when the administration, when you and other officials were saying that our purpose there was purely defensive, that you were already planning the offensive operation. Are those reports correct?
Sam, we never said our purpose was purely defensive. From the very outset, the president said he wanted to keep his options open. And the first deployment of troops had two purposes. One size to constitute a minimum defense against an incursion into Saudi Arabia, the other to keep the president's options open. But the time we had finished that first deployment, which was roughly 250,000, we no longer had kept our options open, because in the meantime he had poured from about 150 to 300, 400,000 troops into Kuwait and around. So the additional deployment was to keep our options.
Well, is it correct that you had made the decision, or the decision had been made, to deploy the additional troops before Election Day, but that you held the announcement till after Election Day?
No.
When did you make that decision?
Oh, I don't know, but it came out, the decision was made at the conclusion of the first deployment. As it was coming up, the question was, do you continue now, or do you stop here and thus have to crank up this whole logistics network again? And the decision was to continue, and it happened to come about election time, but it was not, that was coincidental.
Let's get to a lesson or two of this war. It seems under the current ABM treaty, as construed in many different ways, Israel is able to have U.S. technology defending itself against missile attacks, but the United States is not permitted to have Patriots or the next generation of Patriots to protect us as defensive systems. Does that make sense?
Well, we're allowed 100 Patriots or anything else we want, George.
Is 100 enough for a continental nation, given the technology I mean, Patriot is old technology, really.
Patriot is not even ABM technology,
That's right.
George. I think we need to look again at this and the role that strategic and tactical defenses can
One
play.
quick question before our time runs out. Is there something on the drawing board or in existence beyond the Patriot?
Yes, there's something that the Israelis are developing with SDI funding support, an Arrow ground-to-air
Come back
ballistic
another
missile.
time and tell us about it, will you? Time is up. Thank you. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you, David.
Coming next, our discussion here. Now back with the original cast, Sam. And joining us will be Cokie Roberts of ABC News in a moment. We talked to the general about this, and before we go on to other things, I'd like to raise it again, the question of war crimes, war trials. Has the world moved past the time when we hang people? George, what do you think?
I don't think so. We certainly, if Saddam Hussein had been caught, it would have been inescapable, the precedent of the treatment of the Japanese and German leaders. But ideally, this should be done by Kuwaitis and also Iraqis, because the Iraqis are the principal people who have suffered under Saddam Hussein for more than a decade now. Absent that, it seems to me it's not imperative that we make a big deal of that.
Well, you know, Saddam is one thing, but interesting thing to me is what do you do with the lesser fish who actually committed the crimes, let's say in Kuwait City? The Iraqi soldiers.
The atrocities.
We talked to some of them, and they already are saying, a la Nuremberg, well, we're just following orders. We were told to do it by the big boy. Now, you take a look at some of those bodies there, their eyes gouged out, tied, the atrocities were committed. Do we seek out every one of those Iraqi soldiers and try to bring them to justice? The present mood in Kuwait City is to do it and not give them a trial, just summary execution.
The problem is we don't have a tribunal in place to do it. We don't have Saddam Hussein. It's hard to do it without actually having the guy. But there are bills introduced into Congress to establish that kind of thing, to have an international tribunal set up to regularly have war crimes trials. But I don't see it going anywhere.
You know, another thing that's happening in the city, the Palestinians. A lot of people are afraid that Kuwait City may turn into another Beirut. Palestinians who sided, of course, with Iraq are now living in fear in an enclave. The Sudanese.
This is in Kuwait City.
In Kuwait City, who sided with Iraq, living in fear. They too are being dragged out to some extent and executed on the spot.
Well, in Kuwait, as you know, Sam, they keep a list of native Kuwaitis, and they are the only ones who are promised they can stay there. Others are told to leave, and they have to leave. If they want to get rid of the Palestinians, they have the power to do it.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we'll see what happens. Now, are we indeed the world's policemen now?
Well,
Cokie?
it certainly looks like it. It's a question of whether there are other places that matter to us as much as the Gulf region. Clearly, it was a place that we deemed to be in our national interest. But this war came at a moment when the United States was not feeling very good about itself. You keep in mind that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait right after the Houston summit, where Kaifu and Co. were in pictures, and everybody was saying, who's missing from this picture? The sense that the United States wasn't number one anymore, not on top. The war's turned all of that around, and we are a superpower par excellence again. The United States seems to be very powerful and able to do exactly what it wants to do, and I think that will militate for us going into other places, clearing things up, having it over with.
Well, if we're the world's policemen, let us hope that each time we have to fight a war, we fight against an Iraq, which is taking nothing away from our military, because I think they were, when we get to the portion about winners and losers, one of the great winners, properly so. But Iraq clearly was not prepared to suffer the air bombardment that it suffered, and was not then equipped morally or physically to fight a war against a superpower. Now you say, well, everyone else is in their same shape. If we're going to be the world policeman, it's against Borneo, or we help the Tamils,
Panama,
or something
Grenada.
like that. But if we start trying to go into a larger type of conflict, I think it may be a different story.
What do you think, George?
Well, unquestionably, we are not a superpower. We're the superpower. The only other candidate is currently
Having more
have
trouble.
a rising tide of civil unrest and eventually probably civil war. It's interesting, Cokie goes back a year ago. A year ago, Europe was uniting, and people say, well, Europe's going to be a great foreign policy player. Europe doesn't exist. It's a geographical, not a political expression. Everyone says, well, united Germany may throw its weight around. The principal criticism these days is Germany doesn't throw its weight around. Japan doesn't contribute, and we say military weakness is an unfair trade advantage on the part of the Japanese. So if there's going to be a world policeman, we're going to be it. But that's a question of volition. Henry Kissinger's formulation is a very good one. And he says, Americans don't like to talk the language of balance of power. But in fact, you can dominate in the world, you can have stability in the world by domination or by equilibrium. And I don't think America
we were the policemen here the right way because
requires two objects of equal weight.
Well, applying that analysis to the Middle East, it requires keeping people in balance so no one has an incentive to go to war.
But we've definitely done in part of that equilibrium. I mean, part of his analysis was that we would do surgical strikes into Iraq. That hasn't happened. Iraq is missing all of its infrastructure as well as its military. So the balance of power has disappeared.
There's still a lot of Iraqi divisions up north. He still has an army. It's not quite disarmed.
I feel a little out of it because where I was, I didn't get Mr. Kissinger's analysis. I don't quite know what he said, although I've known him for years, so I can imagine. But
no, you know what he said.
Yes, I do. One thing that was done right here was that we had an agreement on aims, regardless of the reason, whether it was oil or not. And it was done through the United Nations, so we had a world agreement on it. If we're the world's policemen outside of that type of apparatus, simply because we decide who's right and who's wrong, who's up and who's down, I think, talk about pride goeth before
and
the fall.
that's clearly one of the lessons learned, is to go in and to put together those kinds of coalitions before...
If that is a lesson, and I agree it is, that the UN was very important and very useful in this case, and we may have now a normative principle that action is legitimate if and only if it proceeds on this model through the UN. If so, then the United States may look back on this 10 years from now saying this was not a moment in which we achieved a new peak of power, but where we became enmeshed in a way in international law, so-called, and international multilateral diplomacy in a way that further restricts us.
Well, clearly we had the military power. This simply gave us an opportunity to validate what we had all the time. But you talk about we're the one superpower. For years we said that the Soviet was a superpower only because of its force of arms in no other arena. And now we have to examine whether the force of conventional arms really is up to it. Yes, we demoralized the Iraqis with the air bombing. General Scowcroft was correct. But just before the battle, I talked to the commander of the 1st Division, General Griffith, who said, and he was proven quite correct, we're going to stand off. We're going to engage them at 2,000 meters. They can't touch us. Their tanks, their vaunted T-72s, couldn't touch us. We have the kind of...
Because they couldn't see us.
They couldn't see us.
Far too far away.
They can't fire on the move as our M1A1s can. I know the Soviets are now re-examining, but they can't gear up their production lines. They can't do it. Their conventional arms seem to be so far inferior to ours that made it maybe only a superpower in nuclear weapons.
When the Scuds were landing in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, those first few nights, apparently several of the Soviet Jews who were there were saying, typical Soviet-made equipment doesn't work at all.
Does the world need a policeman? Are we working on that assumption? Do we assume that?
Sure, I mean, for the same reason that communities do. There's always going to be sin and crime in the world. There's no question about that. You need some kind of collective security.
Again, as long as we have a world order and law that agrees on what the policeman does. What is the policeman's mandate?
Which laws...
Well, and that is what the UN was established to do, and in this case, somewhat did it. But George is right. It will be a restrictive thing if we keep going back to it.
One of the main reasons we went to war with Iraq, although no one quite puts it this way, is apparent in one of the first targets we hit, for the chemical, biological, and nuclear capacities. Now, you put yourself in the mind, it's hard to do, put yourself in the mind of Gaddafi in Libya. He knows that the United States can stand off on a battleship or a cruiser in the Mediterranean Ocean and end that gas plant of his in the desert without putting at risk a single pilot. That's what we know about Tomahawk missiles now. That gives the United States enormous leverage it may not have to use because it has it.
Well, what do we say? That's an interesting question, George, and I haven't thought it out, but that never has stopped me. What do we say now? That we are not going to permit any country to become a nuclear power outside of the ones that are already now nuclear power.
We're not saying that. And not only is there going to be a proliferation...
Well, we'll decide which countries are good then and which are bad to become nuclear power.
Well, which ones hurt us to become threatening.
Exactly. But it's not just nuclear power.
But Iraq was our friend a year ago.
What we're going to see now is a proliferation of ballistic missile technology, all kinds of delivery systems. And that's why you're going to see, I hope, in this country in the next few years, another fresh look at SDI and another fresh look at the ABM treaty that restricts it.
But I'm still not clear who we let become nuclear powers. A year ago, we were on Iraq's side, or 2 years ago against the war, and a year ago we were still helping them. And April Glaspie, our former ambassador in Baghdad, who got a bum rap, in my view, because she was carrying out the policy that the State Department asked her to, of the Bush administration, was arguing still that Saddam Hussein we needed to be friends with.
Well, she probably is going to appear before a congressional committee sometime during the summer.
Like Admiral Kimmel.
And answer all those questions which we have been unable to ask her. Now, before we go, there are winners here and there are losers. Who are the winners, George?
The United States military, George Bush preeminently, the Republican Party, in part because of what the Democratic Party seemed to do by seeming to have an almost party line vote against what turned out to be a successful war. It wasn't a defining moment for the Democratic Party. It was a reinforcing moment that reinforced a lot of doubts people had about it anyway. The biggest loser is the Palestinian leadership, not the Palestinian people, because if the result of this is that the Palestinian people are free from a leadership that sided with the Axis in the Second World War and sided with the Soviet Union in the Cold War and sided with Saddam in this war, if they're at last free of this rubbish, the Palestinian people can be beneficiaries.
The preeminent winner in my mind was the United States military, the officers and men, and the loser was the stereotype of the U.S. military mind. Maybe it's simply my age, but many, many years ago, the stereotype military was someone who wanted a war or wanted to earn their stripes, wanted to have their ticket punched, etc. And I was over there and found that was not the case. From General Schwarzkopf down, they wanted to not only minimize casualties, I think he worried more about the possibility of American casualties than any other single matter. And down to the Corps commanders, General Franks, down to the division commanders, and down to the sergeants. And this idea that we were in the field ready to fight a war, but really wanted to keep the bloodshed at a minimum, I found to be a tremendous victory.
The volunteer army also, I think you have to say, was vindicated in this encounter. A lot of people thought it was never going to be any good, and it was. I think that all of the list that you all have given, plus Hafez Assad, the head of Syria, has clearly come out of this ahead. And the U.S. defense industry has also come. Raytheon, for instance, is a big winner in this.
Maker of the Patriot.
Right.
Be careful. When I was there and I watched those Patriots shoot down those Scuds, I said half jokingly one morning, well, let's buy Raytheon. The stock will go up, which it did, and I was severely criticized.
George,
let me just say this,
30 seconds.
Was the Democratic Party a loser?
Of course it was a loser. It was a big loser. I think that it
George,
would be very difficult for Democrats to elect anybody anytime soon for president.
I just want to say, Sam talks about American military. I want to say something about the American military tradition. It's a tradition of Eisenhower, Bradley, not General Patton. American military leaders have traditionally been very, very parsimonious with American lives. Douglas MacArthur.
That's why I said he was a stereotype.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all. The time is up. We'll be back with a few words about repairing the war damage and trying the criminals in a moment. There is a tremendous job of rebuilding what it destroyed. The Iraqis have oil if they can find a leader who will pump it and sell it rather than burning the oil wells in an act of historic stupidity. If so, they can fix the damage themselves, theirs and Israel's. About the war crimes trials, they should be held in Kuwait and also the hangings. Then the world and the U.S. can turn back to work on their real problems. For all of us here at ABC News, thank you.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by ADM.
Truce talks in the desert. Iraq agrees to all Allied demands. An Iraqi diplomat announces the first release of Allied POWs. And a jetliner crash in Colorado. All on board are killed. This is the CBS Evening News. Connie Chung reporting. Good evening. Iraq's ambassador to the United Nations says the first of the Allied prisoners of war have been released. The announcement came just a short time ago.
We have already, I believe, released 10 POWs as a gesture of goodwill. 6 of them are American citizens, including one of them, the young lady that was captured a few days ago.
No confirmation yet from U.S. officials either in the Persian Gulf or Washington. General Norman Schwarzkopf had called for an immediate symbolic release and complete release of all POWs during truce talks today with his Iraqi counterparts. Susan Spencer reports.
For this historic meeting, the Allies chose an airfield in southern Iraq, former Republican Guard territory, an airfield they have controlled only for a day and a half. To say security was tight gave new meaning to the term, and the security would apply to the Iraqis, too.
They'll be checked by your security and ours, and then they'll move down to the negotiation.
Now, I don't want them embarrassed in any way, right?
No, sir.
Okay, I don't want them humiliated.
But the general made clear this was not to be an altogether friendly meeting either.
No question about it. I'm not here to give them anything. I'm here to tell them exactly what we expect them to do.
The Iraqis met U.S. forces at a checkpoint miles from the field and were driven to the site in some of the very high-tech machines that so contributed to their downfall, flying the neutral flag now of the Red Crescent. Until the Iraqis showed up, no one knew exactly who would come. The highest-ranking delegates turned out to be 2 lieutenant generals, said to speak on Baghdad's behalf. The meeting lasted just a little over 2 hours, with the question of POWs at the top of the agenda. When the grim-faced Iraqis departed, again courtesy Allied tanks, the general had only good news about the POWs.
We have agreed that this release should be immediate. We have agreed that the details of this release must be worked out by the International Red Cross.
Also to be handled by the Red Cross, the question of the 1,000 of detained Kuwaitis. On other issues, Iraq agreed to provide information on land and sea mines and work with the coalition on border security. Along with external woes, the Iraqis may have new internal problems. Civil unrest is reported growing in the southern city of Basra.
That was one of the concerns of the Iraqi delegation, was being able to get through Basra. I don't think they were worried too much about for their safety, but just the chaos and the upheaval that's going on within that city.
Fleeing civilians confirmed it.
Basra city is everybody fighting. I mean, the people who support for government, the people who's not supporting for government. Now, since 90% of Iraqi people hate Saddam.
The question whether, as the soldiers come home, unrest will grow, leading to the eventual removal of Saddam Hussein, the final item on the American wish list. Susan Spencer, CBS News, in southern Iraq.
The biggest wish of our American troops came true just a few days ago when President Bush announced an end to the shooting. The war was suddenly behind them, and as Peter Van Sant reports, it was time for war stories.
Marines from Fox Company, grim-faced after 4 days of fighting, gather on the outskirts of Kuwait City to hear the news that the war is over.
What does that all mean for us? Okay, we're going to remain in a defensive posture here. I want to make sure that we don't get caught up in the jubilation of all this.
But as word spread, battle-worn faces turned bright. Marines who had worried about getting shot or gassed could finally relax. Thoughts turned homeward.
I'm real excited. I know one day closer to going home, drinking some beer, and being home with the little lady.
I think the first thing I'm going to do is going to lay down on the ground and kiss the ground. I'm ready to get back to America, though. I really do miss him.
The remarkable success of this war can be measured in casualties. This platoon didn't have a single Marine wounded or killed in the fighting.
The best thing is we get to take home all our Marines that we brought here. That's all I really care about.
Tension is replaced with laughter. It is a time for simple pleasures, a time to swap memories of the war.
He's standing on the roof of his tank and knocking on the roof with a rifle butt. Ding, ding, come on out of there.
The Marines unloaded and cleaned their weapons. They had trained for months for battle, expecting that a number of their buddies would be killed. But most never fired a shot in anger. Now, all they want is a chance to enjoy the peace. Peter Van Sant, CBS News, with Fox Company, outside Kuwait City.
With the United States reporting civil unrest in Iraq's second largest city, most Iraqis are being kept in the dark about the true outcome of the war. Betsy Aaron in Baghdad has our report, which was cleared by Iraqi censors.
Iraqis hear the news of the progress towards peace on their transistor radios, not just from Baghdad radio, but from foreign stations.
Any station you change, from BBC World Service to Voice of America, to Monte Carlo, to Paris, you see all of them against us. You can't know the truth. I prepare myself to hear Iraq like that.
Is the world against Iraq or is the world against Saddam Hussein?
Well, there's no differences between Saddam Hussein and Iraqis.
There is news here about the peace talks in the desert, although the radio has not reported the results of those talks. Iraqi television videotaped President Saddam Hussein meeting with the Revolution Command Council and top officials of the Ba'ath Party. The session, they said, took place tonight. The subject, the political situation and the problems of rebuilding and repairing the infrastructure of the country. Iraqi television is back on the air. Electricity is available beginning this evening for at least half the city. And in an irony of war, one of the first programs shown on Baghdad television was the Academy Award-winning American film Rain Man. Betsy Aaron, CBS News, Baghdad.
Here in the U.S., a United Airlines jet with 25 people on board crashed in Colorado Springs today, just missing houses and apartment buildings. Authorities believe there were no survivors. Bob McNamara reports.
Even when the first rescue crews arrived at the crash site, nothing was left to save. United 585 had disintegrated on impact, crashing into a creek bed, narrowly missing a residential park. Lucky were those in a nearby apartment complex from where some saw the plane go down.
I seen the people in the plane. They was banging on the windows.
Oh, I didn't see anyone come out that plane.
Because it caught on fire?
It caught on fire when it hit here, and it flipped over.
Witnesses said that skies were clear at the time of the crash, but that fierce winds were blowing.
There were no deferred maintenance items with respect to the aircraft. There were no reports with respect to mechanical problems, to our knowledge, from the cockpit crew.
Baffling to recovery crews and investigators is the almost total destruction of the Boeing 737, long considered one of the safest passenger jets. A tire and an engine cowling are among only a few of the recognizable parts of the plane, while the rest is shredded fragments. Late today, an investigating team from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived to begin the official probe of the crash.
Flight 585 originated this morning at Moline, Illinois, with an intermittent stop in Denver before coming on to Colorado Springs. There are reports from other pilots before the crash that winds here were gusting from 25 to 45 miles per hour, and there was a wind shear alert on at the time. So far, one of the plane's 2 flight data recorders have been recovered, and in that, investigators hope to find the cause. Connie?
Thank you, Bob McNamara. 3 Navy crew members died today when their plane crashed in a Chicago suburb. The T-39 jet nosedived into a residential area near the Glenview Naval Air Station. Witnesses say the pilot appeared to be taking extraordinary measures to avoid hitting homes. No one on the ground was hurt. Still ahead on the CBS Evening News, more from the Gulf, including Bob McEwen on the rebuilding of Kuwait. And later,
Saddam Hussein's army. The Iraqis, it turns out, were even inept in their effort to wreck Kuwait when they found out they couldn't keep it.
Some of the hotels have been trashed, windows shot out, furniture taken out, destroyed, cut up, burned, those kinds of things. But other than that, it's been a pretty a surprise to us that things are in as good a shape as we found them.
Army civil affairs experts who are helping the Kuwait government spend its vast wealth to help rebuild the country are finding that roads, bridges, and housing largely escaped damage, either by Iraqis or U.S. troops. Life in Kuwait City is still difficult because of the lack of running water or electricity. The retreating Iraqis blasted power plants with grenades and cut major transmission lines. With no electricity to pump gasoline, this OPEC member is getting a taste of fuel shortages, which should end when the power comes back in a few days. It will take much longer to get Kuwait back online as an oil producer. The job of snuffing out 500 wellhead fires is so unprecedented, the experts cannot even hazard a guess as to how long it will take.
This is the crime of the centuries and not the century.
Iraq also destroyed Kuwait's telephone service by stealing thousands of phones. Today, hundreds of Kuwaitis lined up for their first phone calls in months at a satellite hookup provided by AT&T.
I told my mother, my father, my son, my husband, all my brother, all my family.
Kuwait's army is pressing the hunt for Palestinians suspected of helping the Iraqis. Surprisingly, there have been no reports of revenge killings, even though everyone seems to have a gun dropped on the ground by Saddam's army. Eric Engberg, CBS News, Kuwait City.
American forces today took over a Gulf island that controls the approaches to Kuwait City. More than 1,400 Iraqis gave up without a fight. A Kuwaiti official estimated today it will cost $50 billion to rebuild the emirate. The Kuwaiti people are starting to rebuild their lives, as Bob McEwen reports.
Sunday afternoon on the dock by the Persian Gulf. Jessim Aidi, assistant manager of the Port of Kuwait, returns to his office for the first time in 7 months.
Last time it was Wednesday, 1st of August.
The day before the invasion?
The day before.
The Iraqis, who have been here since, left behind an official portrait of Saddam Hussein and the debris of their occupation. Since the Iraqis fled last Monday, Kuwaitis are just beginning to realize the extent of what Saddam's soldiers did to their country and to their lives. Some may never recover.
See this rubbish? Side. What are they doing in the manager's offices?
The words on this wall say, "Long live Saddam," leader of the Republican Guards. But the guards are long gone, and the conscripts who replaced them left pathetic signs of their malicious stay. A newspaper comparing Hitler to Saddam, an officer's jacket, a Molotov cocktail they had no time to throw, pin-ups, and a prayer rug.
I thought that it will be a trouble place, so I found it more than I thought in my mind.
There's a cross-section of goods stolen from Kuwait, the leftovers of a looting spree, the bullets they used to get them.
It's full of, what do they call it?
Ammunition.
Ammunition for destroying.
And on the wall, there's a final farewell, an unnecessary reminder that someone was here. Bob McEwen, CBS News, Kuwait City.
Developments today, Allied and Iraqi military leaders met and Iraq agreed to all UN demands governing a ceasefire. Iraq has reportedly released 10 Allied war prisoners, including 6 Americans, one of them a woman. And clashes between supporters and opponents of Saddam Hussein have been reported in 4 cities in Iraq. The meeting between Iraqi and Allied military leaders took place early this morning. The two sides spent 2 hours talking in a tent in the Iraqi desert. When they emerged, U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf was pleased with what had been accomplished. Here is a report from Andy Field.
Then they'll move down to the negotiation. Okay, now I don't want them embarrassed in any way, right? No, sir. Okay, I don't want them humiliated.
General Norman Schwarzkopf did everything he could to ensure that the defeated Iraqi generals kept as much dignity as possible at the desert meeting. It took only 2 hours for them to listen and agree to everything he demanded, to make sure that Allied forces holster their weapons for good.
I am very happy to tell you that we agreed on all matters.
That means Iraq will get thousands of their war prisoners back in exchange for the few U.S. and Allied prisoners it captured in the fighting. Iraq has told the Allies where it's hidden all the land and sea mines. It will agree to do everything it can to stop the few remaining troops from fighting their way through coalition forces. But when will the American troops finally come home?
According to the United Nations resolutions have to be accepted by Iraq. We have to have a ceasefire. As soon as we have a ceasefire, we will start withdrawing forces from Iraq.
Iraqi military leaders didn't talk publicly, but the man who led the Saudi forces said today's peace meeting could mean that decades of suffering throughout the Middle East may finally be over.
I think it's every Arab dream in this area to have unity and prosperity and peace.
While the U.S. and the Allies continue clearing the mines and healing the wounds back here at home, there's still one loose end left, Saddam Hussein. And the Allies are still trying to find ways to bring him to justice.
What the international community is willing to do by way of its dealings with Iraq is going to be affected by whether that regime continues in power.
General Schwarzkopf is the man in power here. And if Iraq keeps its word, the peace will hold and Allied prisoners should be heading home this week. In Washington, I'm Andy Field.
Saddam Hussein has started repairing his war-torn country. On Baghdad radio, they reported today that Saddam had 2 meetings. He met first with the government officials to discuss trying to restore television and radio service to Iraq. Then he met with the Revolutionary Command Council to talk about restoring some basic public services. At a London hospital, 4 CBS newsmen released by Iraq yesterday were reported in good condition today. The 4 had been held captive 40 days in Iraq. They had lost weight because of malnutrition. CBS reporter Bob Simon described what it was like to be a prisoner in Iraq.
Well, the Iraqis starved us and beat us, threatened our lives, and terrorized us. In fact, the only time we came close to death was through American bombs, when the Americans bombed the building we were in. And the one reaction I still can't explain to myself is what Roberto just described, as when those bombs started hitting, the dead calm I felt.
More of that interview with Bob Simon and his crew on 60 Minutes right after this newscast.
Also on 60 begun the trek home from Basra in northern Iraq tonight. Some say that they've seen a strong movement to topple Saddam developing among their Iraqi captors over the past few days. The Kuwaitis say they were grabbed off the streets on any pretext and jammed into crowded prisons in Basra with very little food. Now they say they just want to get back home. Tonight, the CBS crew held captive by the Iraqis for 40 days is in a London hospital. Correspondent Bob Simon, a CBS producer and a 2-man technical crew, arrived in London earlier today. Anchorman Dan Rather was one of the people on hand to greet them. Simon and his crew are reported to be in good condition, but they'll be undergoing a full battery of medical testing. The 4 men say they were beaten while in captivity. One of them suffered an ankle injury after a bomb hit the building where he was held. The CBS crew was freed yesterday. Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev is said to have had a hand in getting them released. A nationwide recall.
Now, Channel 7 News.
Good evening. I'm Ana Chavez.
And I'm Richard Brown.
War are expected to be set free. Tonight, 10 former prisoners of war are held in the security and comfort of the U.S. Navy medical ship Mercy. And tonight, an Air Force colonel says they all appear to be in excellent shape, physically and psychologically. The 9 men and 1 woman were released early today in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad and then transferred to Amman, Jordan. After working their way through a crush of news reporters, they went on to Bahrain and out to the USNS Mercy. Back home, families are excited and relieved.
Last couple of days was like the first couple of days. So today was a big relief because relief seeing him.
I'm thrilled, but it's tempered a little bit, and there's still a lot of POWs and MIAs that we're really concerned about and praying for. But it was certainly a great relief, and I thank God that the prayers were answered.
The parents of Army Specialist Melissa Rathbun are also grateful tonight.
Heavy burden not knowing where she was, how she was, whether she was safe, hurt, injured, whatever. And now all that uncertainty is gone.
Here are the names of the 6 Americans set free today. Iraq's ambassador to the UN has said 33 more will be released within hours. Although the 6 Americans released today have not been thoroughly debriefed, an Air Force spokesman says it seems they have not been tortured or abused. According to Air Force Colonel Wynn Mabry, many of the injuries suffered by the pilots may have been the result of high-speed ejections from their planes. Richard?
That is not the case with CBS News correspondent Bob Simon and his crew. Speaking to the news media today in London, Simon outlined the torture they went through, including solitary confinement, blindfolding, and beatings.
Well, the other terror was starvation. I think we all found out what the word hunger means, which is something we thought we knew about before these 24 days, but never did.
Simon says his family was threatened and remembers the Iraqis' exact words.
We consider you a spy. If you ever want to see them again, you must tell us. So it was, instead of asking profession, where do you live, this, that, it was just, they just set up, wife, daughter, do you ever want to see them again? And then you better start talking.
Simon said he would have killed his captors with no more remorse than killing a cockroach in his room. From within Kuwait tonight, reports the ruling family is targeting pro-democracy leaders for assassination. The president of a leading Kuwaiti bank says hit squads and assassination teams are being organized and financed by members of the Al Sabah family. One man alleged to be a victim of an assassination attempt spoke with Nightline's Ted Koppel.
My name? He's supposed to give me the impression that I know him, and he knows me. I walked towards him, and then he shot at me when I was not more than 2 yards from him.
The assassination task is, to our understanding, composed of the ex-CID Kuwaitis.
Now the CID here is what?
Mabahith.
That's the secret police?
That's the secret police, yes.
The charges have been denied by a member of the El Sabah family, specifically the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States.
The first senior member of the Kuwaiti royal family is back in his homeland tonight. The Prime Minister, Crown Prince Sheikh Saad Al Abdullah Al Sabah, and his family arrived in Kuwait City today. He's expected to govern the country under martial law for the next 3 months. Although that rule may not be smooth, he says he's glad to be back.
I am happy to be back to my beloved country.
The prince made a first-hand survey of the damage to the nation's capital. He found his palace virtually destroyed. The prince and his family will be pressed to make good on their promise to restore Kuwait's parliament, which they dissolved in 1986. One of the first orders of business for the newly liberated country was to express its gratitude. One of the ways Kuwait chose to do that was to send a big thank you note to the United States. It did so by way of the New York Times. Kuwait took out this full-page ad, which appeared in the newspaper today. It's addressed to the people of the United States from the people of Kuwait.
An Army supply clerk is now fighting the biggest battle of her career.
You can buy groceries at Lucky and save a little, but you get a lot more for the same money at Pack and Save. Pack and Save. You can't get groceries for less. Lucky says that they're the low price leader. At Pack and Save, you get low prices plus something extra. Change. Pack and Save. You can't get groceries for less. Lucky claims that they're still the low price leader. Well, if you'd like a little surprise, look a little lower. Pack and Save. You can't get groceries for less.
Tonight, charges that Kuwait's ruling family is hiring hit squads to assassinate members of Kuwait's democratic opposition.
He came to my home. He knows how to get inside. He knows how to open the door. There is no electricity. He called me my name.
We'll focus on those charges and that story tonight.
This is ABC News Nightline. Reporting from Washington with the latest on the Persian Gulf, Ted Koppel.
Kuwait's nightmare of Iraqi occupation is over, but as you will hear tonight, Kuwait City is teetering on the brink of becoming another Beirut. There is growing tension between Sunni and Shiite Muslims in Kuwait. Palestinians, who may in fact outnumber Kuwaitis in that country at the moment, are already being singled out for reprisal because some Palestinians collaborated with Iraqis during the occupation. Members of the Kuwaiti resistance speak contemptuously of their fellow citizens who sat out the war and avoided danger in other countries. They speak defiantly of refusing to give up their weapons to the authority of the old government as it begins to trickle back into Kuwait. Resistance fighters and members of the political opposition who've been pushing for greater democratic freedom in Kuwait are openly resentful of the fact that martial law is being imposed by the old government, which is now returning to power. While we were in Kuwait City, several people told us privately that they have evidence of assassination squads, reportedly organized and financed by members of the ruling Al Sabah family. Hit squads targeting members of the democratic opposition. One man was prepared to make the charge publicly, and because he is one of Kuwait's leading citizens, chairman of the board of Kuwait's second largest bank, the Gulf Bank of Kuwait, we are going to broadcast that interview now. The man's name, Dr. Abdulaziz Sultan.
I have strong reason to believe that some members, yes, of Al-Sabah family are setting up, let's put it this way, some assassination task here in Kuwait. We have heard that certain members have set up in certain Arab countries, and they have formed some militia of some Kuwaitis and mercenaries with the intended aim to force their rule in Kuwait, and that some other members of the family have the intention to send some task forces here to Kuwait to assassinate the pro-democracy movement, prominent people in Kuwait.
You know, what you've been telling me might sound just like a James Bond story, were it not for the fact that a leading pro-democratic opposition leader was shot at his home by, what, 2 would-be assassins?
One.
Do you have any idea of the nationality?
Well, yes, his wife overheard the conversation between them. The man asked him if he is Hamad al-Juhan, and the answer was yes. And he asked him if he knew him, and the answer was no. And then he shot him.
The victim of that assassination attempt, Hamad al-Juhan, is under heavy guard at this hospital in Kuwait City. When we visited the hospital, we encountered the newly returned Kuwaiti Minister of Health. The man who was shot the other day, how is his condition?
His condition is okay.
I had heard that the bullet hit the spine.
Right.
Will he recover from that, or will he be paralyzed?
Well, he's paralyzed already.
But if Dr. al-Juhan is being visited by a member of the Kuwaiti government, he is being guarded by members of the resistance who do not trust the government to protect him. Who do you think did this to you?
I think nobody can. No comment. But it was deliberately. He came to my home. He knows how to get inside. He knows how to open the door. There is no electricity. He called me my name. He's supposed to give me the impression that I know him and he knows me. I walked towards him, and then he shot at me when I was not more than 2 yards from him.
Do you think
and he didn't say anything, but he was Kuwaiti.
You recognize the accent?
Yes, I'm sure. There are so many from inside, from outside, who don't want this area to be stable and secure.
If Dr. al-Juhan is vague about who was behind his shooting, Aziz Sultan, the banker, is more specific. In one instance, you talk about an assassination squad. In another instance, you talk about a larger group of people who have come in. Who are these people? What kinds of assassination squads or hit teams are you talking about?
Well, I could only say what we've heard and what we tend to believe at the moment. The assassination task is, to our understanding, composed of the ex-CID Kuwaitis.
Now the CID here is what?
Mabahith.
That's the secret police?
That's the secret police, yes. The other larger group, our understanding is there is somebody who's been stationed or staying in one Arab country, that he had formulated a militia of about, an estimate about 3,000 people of Kuwaitis and some mercenaries, with the objective of forcing their rule here, or some other objectives we cannot really pinpoint at the moment.
Why would it be necessary for the Al-Sabah family to engage in these kinds of plots? They control the military anyway.
Yes, but I'm not sure at the moment, especially what happened to Kuwait and what happened to the Kuwaiti army, that there is that much confidence in the armed forces.
On the one hand, you've been very cautious. We have reason to believe. We have heard about. We have seen reports. On the other hand, you're a very distinguished member of the business community here, but you're dealing with more than just reason to believe, aren't you?
Yes, we are. We do have some hard evidence, but I'm not at liberty at the moment to really divulge that. But
why are you telling me the story at all?
Oh, because I think maybe by telling this story, we could avert violence in Kuwait.
Aren't you afraid that something will happen to you?
Yes, I've been afraid that something will happen to me in the last 7 months, and I'm afraid that something might happen to me in the future, but in the process, I might be able to really save the others.
Coming up next to answer some of the charges we've just heard, a member of the Kuwaiti royal family, Sheikh Saud Nasir al-Sabah, the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Ford.
Calumet Farm in Kentucky has produced more legendary racehorses than any other stable. Whirlaway, Citation, Alydar. When excellence becomes a tradition, there's no end to the greatness. And it doesn't happen only in horse racing. Ford has set the pace in the auto industry from the outset. And with billions of dollars invested in models like our new Crown Victoria and Grand Marquis, we're going to stay out in front. Ford Motor Company.
What if I take the fifth?
You end up guilty by suspicion.
In 1951, Hollywood endured a campaign of censorship
We need to protect this country from their films and their television shows.
that destroyed friendships.
Don't make me crawl through the mud.
Separated families
Did you name me? Did you name your son?
and divided the country.
Are you now a member of the Communist Party?
Don't you have an ounce of decency?
Guilty by suspicion. Rated PG-13. Starts Friday, March 15th at a theater near you.
The world's fastest aircraft. 1909, the Signal Corps Flyer, 30 miles per hour. 1932, the GB, 300 miles per hour. 1966, the SR-71 Blackbird Mach 3. Today, DHL Worldwide Express van, faster to more countries than Federal Express, UPS, or any major express company. DHL, faster to more of the world.
Now's the most exciting time ever to enjoy Charlie Brown's famous prime rib and shrimp scampi dinner, because you're invited to help us celebrate our 26th anniversary. To make it really special, we're serving our thick, juicy corn-fed prime rib with our savory shrimp scampi. The complete dinner is only $12.95 during Charlie Brown's 26th anniversary celebration. Charlie Brown's, great prime, great time.
His AIDS drug rejected in America as worthless. Now this man is experimenting with it on desperate AIDS babies in Romania. Primetime investigates Thursday.
Joining us here in our Washington bureau is the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States and a member of the royal family, Sheikh Saud Nasir al-Sabah. Ambassador al-Sabah, yours is a very large family. It's possible, I suppose, isn't it, that some members of the family could be engaged in the kind of activities that Dr. Aziz Sultan charged a moment ago without other members knowing about it?
Well, Ted, welcome back home. And I would say that both of those gentlemen that you referred to are friends of mine, Mr. Al-Jawaan and Mr. Sultan, especially Mr. Al-Jawaan, which we strongly condemn what has happened to him. He's a friend of mine, and I've known him for years. And these acts of violence are not in our habits or our customs in Kuwait. And I'm extremely disappointed with Mr. Sultan's statement when he just threw out those accusations, which are, as he said, he has hard evidence which he did not produce, and then he said he had reasons to believe, and I noticed that you tried to get this evidence out, which he was unable to do so. And I would caution, you know, that
well, he wasn't
friends
unable.
like,
he was unwilling, Mr. Ambassador.
well,
under these circumstances.
unwilling sometimes is tantamount to unable. And I would caution, you know, Mr. Sultan and others not to fall into the trap of people who are trying to drive a wedge between the Kuwaiti people. You know, we've seen this happening in Lebanon in the past, and this is one of the causes of the problems and the chaos in Lebanon. And I hope that people responsible, which I have full respect for, Mr. Sultan, and I've known him many years, a friend of mine, a chairman of the Gulf Bank, a very responsible person. And I hope he will realize the importance of the political ramifications of such statements, which are not really supported by any evidence, and should be very cautious in not letting other people drive a wedge between the Kuwaiti people.
Well, some of the charges, Mr. Ambassador, indeed do seem to be supported by some evidence, and I can't claim to have found much of it, but I am aware, for example, of the fact that Scotland Yard passed on word to one of your distinguished pro-democracy leaders in London that there was a plot against him by some IRA hitmen who had been hired, and the charge was, had been hired by members of the al-Sabah family.
Ted, I could very clearly deny all these facts and condemn any attempt on the part of the family to do such criminal acts. It's not in our habits, it's not in our customs. I mean, there are pure speculations coming out of nowhere. And I would like to see any evidence of this nature, because I, one of them, would not like to see such things happening. And if some irresponsible people are doing it, I will be the one going against them in doing such acts against Kuwaiti people. We're not splinters or a divergence of people inside Kuwait. We are one family. We've grown up this way and will continue to grow up this way.
Well, with all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, you made the point yourself a moment ago that Abdulaziz Sultan is a responsible member of your business community, one of the most prominent in all of Kuwait. I ask you quite simply, what advantage could he gain? I can see lots of disadvantages for him, but I can't imagine what advantage he would gain by making a charge like this unless he were absolutely convinced it was true.
Well, I don't know, Ted. Maybe he was fascinated with you being interviewed by Ted Koppel, you know, something which some people in Kuwait might find it very privileged to be so.
Yes, well,
he's
with all due respect, Mr. Ambassador, he's not an unsophisticated man, and I think he's fascinated by much larger things than being interviewed by an American television correspondent.
Well, I would like to see such evidence before I try to speculate, because, you know, we're extremely troubled by the statement by a person like Abdulaziz, who is a friend of mine, and I would like to see evidence of this, because this is exactly what our enemies are trying to do, to drive this wedge and to show the family as the bad people of trying to assassinate people in Kuwait, and that's completely untrue and unfounded.
All right, Mr. Ambassador, we're going to take a short break. We'll continue with Ambassador al-Sabah in a few minutes as we focus on political problems that have been festering in Kuwait long before last August, but have now boiled to the surface because of the occupation.
Pool is like life.
How so?
I don't know. I just remember a guy said that to me once, and I never asked him what he meant.
Why not?
Well, you know, I didn't want to sound stupid.
Just saving it up, huh? Relax. You're among friends. Levi's 100% cotton Dockers.
What makes a child seat safe is how an adult uses it. To make sure you're using your child's seat right, see an Allstate agent for a free booklet.
You probably knew The Good Guys is the best place for video and audio. But did you know The Good Guys is also the best place for cellular phones and cameras and telephones and home office equipment and even a wide variety of video games? The Good Guys, the best in audio and video, and a lot more. We're The Good Guys. We've got to be good. Nobody beats Home Depot. Nobody. Home Depot will beat any price, any store, any identical item, any day. And low prices are just the beginning. Home Depot features Morgan solid wood entry doors in a wide variety of styles. We also carry Weiser deadbolts and lock sets to keep your home safe and secure.
When you're with us at Home Depot, you feel right at home.
Your Northern California Mitsubishi Motors dealers invites you for the drive of your life in a Mitsubishi 3000 GT, awarded Motor Trend Import Car of the Year. So we're celebrating with great deals on all new Eclipse models, including Eclipse Turbo, a Motor Trend top import buy, and a Sports Coupe 2 years in a row. Act now for a great deal on the Mitsubishi Eclipse of your choice. For big savings, picture yourself here. Your Northern California Mitsubishi Motors dealers.
She was the world's most powerful woman. Now, in her first interview since being forced to resign, Margaret Thatcher tells her story to Barbara Walters. 2020, Friday.
The returning U.S. troops tomorrow. Will the jobs they left behind still be theirs? Also, what to do when recession hits home, and director Oliver Stone on Good Morning America tomorrow.
Earlier in the broadcast, we saw how Kuwait's liberation has brought out a number of internal problems. As ABC's Sheila McVicker reports now from Kuwait City, those problems are wide-ranging.
Seven months after he fled his country for exile in the Saudi Arabian city of Taif, Kuwait's crown prince returned home.
I am happy to be back to my beloved country, to see my brothers, to see my sisters after I have been away.
Many Kuwaitis who suffered the Iraqi occupation wonder why it has taken the royal family, the Sabahs, so long. They want to know why their government has delivered the confinements of martial law rather than badly needed food and water.
I would feel comfortable with a martial law in position imposed if I trusted the government and people who are going to execute and oversee the martial law execution. They're not trustworthy in my book.
Why are they not worthy of being trusted?
They are incompetent. They are responsible for the defeat, our occupation. They've led this country to a disastrous situation. And when people woke up on August 2nd, they found nobody around. No government, no responsible, no sheikh, nobody.
Last October, Kuwaitis in exile came to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. They represented all of Kuwait's political factions. In the end, even those who didn't like the emir voted to support him and his family. In turn, the Sabahs promised a constitutional democracy, one where the people would participate in running the country. Since Kuwait's independence in 1961, the Sabahs have toyed many times with democracy. But 5 years ago, the emir dissolved the country's parliament after months of confrontation. Since then, there has been frequent conflict, sometimes even violence, between the Sabahs and those who support democracy. The liberation of Kuwait was supposed to bring elected politicians to this building. But Kuwaitis who support democratic movements say martial law is an indication the Sabahs may not keep the promises of Jeddah.
Well, I think it's one of the signs that make us believe that the government is not serious about bringing back democracy.
I think, what we have went through justify the fact that the Kuwait of the future should be more open, should be more democratic. I think it's very well justified in the experience that we have had here.
Kuwaitis say they have been changed by the occupation. They are now more self-reliant. Because people need bread, it is volunteers who run this bakery, not government orders. The lines outside are still divided by tradition and sex, women's lives defined by religion and culture. In spite of that, some Kuwaiti women fought with the resistance, and many women say it's time to demand the right to vote. I want to see equality between men and women, she says. Women held nothing back in defense of this country. I want a vote.
I don't think these people, especially those who lost their sons and daughters during the resistance, or during this war, are going to be very happy and going to sit idle and do nothing if the government
tries to ignore